Hello everyone, and welcome to another Fusion SuperCollider. Today we're going to look at day 56 of the Bible reading plan, and we will also be checking out a couple quick snippets from day 42. Now, if you take a look over here, you will see a list of all of the verses that we have coming up over the next several days. Now let's begin together. We're going to be reading Acts chapter 23, verses 12 through 27. Now, this is a really cool section of passage where we see Paul going on trial. There's all sorts of cool things you'd see on a drama TV show. So let's take a look at what Paul is up to here in Acts 23. It says this: "The next morning some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, 'We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there.' But when the sons of Paul's sister heard this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called out one of the centurions and said, 'Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him.' So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, 'Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you.' The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, 'What is it you want to tell me?' He said, 'Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting to ambush him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request.' The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: 'Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me.' Paul is then transferred to Caesarea. Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them, 'Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix.' He wrote a letter as follows: 'Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen.'" Now, we have a lot more in this section to read about our good buddy Paul, but what happens to him is this: he's taken over to meet with this Governor Felix, and Felix basically questions him himself, and he safely arrives there. But Paul spends a bunch of time explaining, "I'm a follower of the way. I didn't do anything wrong. I came to the temple to worship God, and I believe Jesus is God. That's all." And so Paul was spending some time imprisoned and on trial. And with all of these struggles, we pick back up a full chapter later. And then in verse 24, we see Felix, after he's talked with Paul, says this: "Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about his faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, 'That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you.' And at the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently to talk with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison." So Paul is being chased down by a bunch of dudes who just want him killed. Paul, all he is doing is sharing the gospel that Jesus Christ came to save. And that has left him just as an afterthought of some of these people and stuck in prison for 2 years, just waiting on some sort of answer. But I wanted to look at these passages with you, and we'll add in another passage as we break these down. When we heard this thing that Felix did, bringing Paul before his wife. I found a couple interesting little snippets that I want to compare to reading that you've already done on day 42. Remember verse 24. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid. Now, that makes me interested because not too many days ago, we were reading about the conversion of Paul. You see, Paul was somebody who spent some time doing some very wicked things and really deeply hated the church and people who would say they were followers of the way. In fact, if you remember, his old name, Saul used to be the guy standing there holding the cloaks of the guys who were stoning and killing Stephen. And so let me remind you of that if you've kept up with that part of the reading. So it also says early on in Acts chapter 9, it says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing murderous threats against the Lord and his disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way," that is, anyone sharing their faith in Jesus, "whether men or women, he might take them prisoners to Jerusalem. And he neared Damascus on his journey. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell on the ground and heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' he asked. 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. 'Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.'" You see, Paul goes from someone who hates, imprisons, and kills people who follow the way, or Christians, people who love Jesus, to just a few chapters later, Paul is imprisoned and being abused, and people are plotting to kill him because he loves Jesus. Now that should say something very, very important to us. That should tell us that something incredibly drastic has happened to change him from a killer to a healer, a absolute hateful person who specifically hated Jesus and his followers, to someone who became chief of Jesus's followers. Paul has an incredible story, and I hope you've kept up with your reading with us. If you haven't, each email each week will have a list of the reading days for our Bible reading plan, and I'm also working on updating that so it's a little bit easier to understand with the dates. But I hope you didn't miss that part, that this story of conversion is so much evidence of a historical truth. And I hope we don't miss how much Jesus can change someone who should have been considered a terrorist into somebody who is considered one of the greatest church fathers we could ever possibly ask for. And so I ask you today, is there anything you don't think Jesus can change in you? And then remember Paul, because if he can change Paul from a guy named Saul, he can change you too. And so that's it for today's Fusion Super Collider. I hope you keep up with the reading. Stay tuned and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.